What if everything you've been taught about faith and finances has been keeping you trapped in a cycle of lack, disguised as spiritual wisdom? For centuries, one biblical passage has been weaponized against believers, twisted into a tool of control that has nothing to do with what was originally meant. Man shall not live by bread alone. You've heard it preached from pulpits, quoted in Sunday school, used to shame people for wanting financial security or a comfortable life. But what if the true meaning of these words holds the key to unlimited abundance, a secret so revolutionary that it threatened the very foundation of religious control over believers' wallets and lives? Smith Wigglesworth, one of the most powerful spiritual teachers of the 20th century, spent decades wrestling with this exact verse. He watched as church leaders used these sacred words to keep their congregations poor and dependent, all while building golden cathedrals and living in luxury themselves. Has this ever happened to you? Sitting in a church service, hearing that desiring prosperity somehow makes you less spiritual, less faithful, less worthy. Meanwhile, you're struggling to pay your bills, wondering why God's abundance seems reserved for everyone except you. The guilt, the shame, the confusion about whether wanting financial freedom contradicts your faith, it's a burden millions carry, never realizing they've been fed a centuries-old lie. But before we begin, please hit the like button and let me know where in the world you're watching from today. It's always fascinating seeing who's joining us from around the world. And if you haven't already, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any of our future videos. Here's what the religious establishment doesn't want you to know. Wigglesworth discovered the authentic meaning of this passage during his darkest hour in 1946, when he found himself with almost nothing, facing financial ruin, despite years of faithful service and spiritual devotion. In that moment of crisis, with rent overdue and creditors knocking, something shifted in his understanding that would change not only his life, but the lives of thousands who would later learn this principle. What you're about to discover might surprise you. This teaching isn't about rejecting money or embracing poverty to prove your spirituality. It's about something far more powerful, far more practical, and far more accessible than you've ever been told. The verse speaks of an invisible source, a consciousness that precedes and actually creates all material abundance. Stay with me until the end, because once you grasp what Wigglesworth understood about every word that proceeds from the mouth of God, your entire relationship with money, provision, and divine supply will never be the same. This isn't religious theory or empty philosophy. This is a proven principle that transformed Wigglesworth's life from desperation to demonstration, from barely surviving to thriving in ways that defied every material circumstance stacked against him. What happened in those critical weeks after his revelation would prove that living by this understanding makes worry about supply completely unnecessary. But to understand how this works, we need to go back to that cold night in 1946, when everything Wigglesworth thought he knew about provision, faith, and the nature of abundance was about to be turned completely upside down. Picture this: San Francisco, November 1946. Smith Wigglesworth sits alone in a cramped apartment staring at $17, the sum total of everything he owns in the world. Rent is due in 72 hours. The disconnect notices are piled on the table. The eviction warning arrived that morning. And here's the man who has preached faith, taught divine provision, encouraged thousands to trust in something beyond the material world, now facing the very real possibility of homelessness. Every spiritual teaching he'd ever embraced suddenly felt like hollow words echoing in an empty room. The irony wasn't lost on him. How could he talk about abundant supply when he couldn't even cover his basic bills? This is where the real transformation begins, not in the prosperity and success stories we love to hear about, but in the breaking point where everything you thought you knew gets stripped away. That cold November night, desperate and exhausted, Wigglesworth experienced what he would later call the most important revelation of his entire spiritual journey. The breakthrough didn't come from praying harder or trying to manufacture more faith. It came from a complete shift in understanding, a hidden truth that had been staring him in the face all along, buried beneath layers of religious conditioning and misinterpretation. The moment of clarity hit him like lightning. He'd been approaching the entire concept of provision from the wrong angle. All those prayers begging God for money, all that anxiety about where the next dollar would come from, all that focus on the material circumstances, he suddenly saw it for what it was, living by bread alone. He'd been treating the visible, material world as if it were the source, as if money itself had power, as if the bank account or the paycheck or the physical resources were what sustained life. But the verse didn't say we live by bread. It said we don't live by bread alone. There was something else, something he'd been completely missing. If you haven't already joined our community here, go ahead and subscribe because we dive deep into these transformative spiritual principles that actually shift consciousness and change lives from the inside out. Bread, Wigglesworth realized, is merely the effect. It's the visible manifestation, the end result, the physical form that appears in the material world. But what creates the bread? What force operates behind the scenes, prior to and more powerful than any material form? Jesus pointed to it clearly. Every word that proceeds from the mouth of God, not literal scripture to memorize, but an invisible, continuous flow of divine intelligence, creative power, spiritual consciousness that exists before anything takes physical shape. This consciousness doesn't depend on economic conditions, doesn't fluctuate with the stock market, doesn't diminish when circumstances look desperate. It's the source behind all visible supply, the cause that produces every effect we see in the material realm. The impact of this understanding was immediate and profound. Wigglesworth stopped begging for things and started recognizing the invisible source within his own awareness. He shifted his entire mindset from dependency on material forms to trust in the consciousness that creates those forms. This wasn't positive thinking or mental tricks. This was recognizing a fundamental truth about the nature of reality and supply. Within 3 weeks, his situation transformed. Completely. Not through struggle or manipulation, but through opportunities that appeared from directions he never could have predicted or planned. Now, I want to go even deeper into this because understanding the distinction between living by bread and living by the word changes everything about how you approach money, provision, and abundance. Write in the comments, "I'm ready for this shift." Here's what most people never grasp about how supply actually works in the universe. We've been conditioned from childhood to believe that matter creates supply, that the physical world is the cause of our abundance or lack. You work a job, you get a paycheck, you buy things. It all seems so straightforward, so logical, so material. The entire system operates on the assumption that money, resources, physical assets, these tangible things, are what sustain life. But Wigglesworth's revelation flipped this entire paradigm on its head. He realized he'd been living completely backwards, treating effects as if they were causes, worshiping the creation instead of recognizing the creator behind it all. Think about your own life for a moment. When you pray about finances, what are you actually praying for? Be honest. Most of us are begging for things, asking God to send money, to provide a better job, to make the business succeed, to solve the immediate material problem staring us in the face. We're focused entirely on acquiring the bread, getting the physical manifestation, securing the visible supply. But this approach keeps us trapped in a cycle of perpetual need because we're operating from the level of effect, not cause. We're trying to manipulate outcomes instead of accessing the source that creates those outcomes in the first place. Wigglesworth's transformation came from a radical shift in consciousness. Instead of praying to get things, he began recognizing the infinite source within his own awareness. This wasn't some abstract spiritual concept divorced from practical reality. This was understanding that consciousness itself, divine intelligence, creative power, infinite wisdom, is the actual source of all material supply. Everything you see in the physical world first existed as consciousness, as an idea, as invisible creative energy before it took form. The job opportunity exists first as divine intelligence knowing the perfect match. The business success exists first as creative ideas flowing through awareness. The financial provision exists first as infinite supply expressing through consciousness. Within 3 weeks of this fundamental shift, opportunities flooded into Wigglesworth's life, from completely unexpected directions. Not random luck, not answered prayers in the traditional sense, He'd simply stopped blocking the natural flow by finally accessing the true source that had been present all along, waiting for recognition. The money came through channels he never would have predicted. The solutions appeared in ways his limited human mind couldn't have orchestrated. And here's the key insight that changes everything. This wasn't a reward for correct thinking or divine favoritism. It was the natural, inevitable result of aligning with how reality actually operates at the deepest level. When Jesus spoke about living by every word that proceeds from the mouth of God, he wasn't giving people another religious rule to follow or scripture verses to memorize. He was pointing to something far more profound and practical. This phrase describes the continuous, unending flow of divine ideas, infinite intelligence, creative power, and spiritual guidance flowing through consciousness right now in this very moment. Not yesterday's inspiration or tomorrow's hoped-for breakthrough, but the living, active, present movement of creative consciousness expressing itself continuously. This flow never stops operating. It never diminishes during economic recessions. It never depends on material circumstances or external conditions. It's the eternal source behind every temporary material form. Most people live their entire lives completely unaware of this flow, this infinite intelligence operating within their own consciousness. They're so hypnotized by the material world, so focused on visible circumstances, so consumed by the bread level of reality, that they never access the word level where all creation originates. But once you recognize this truth, once you shift your primary dependence from material forms to spiritual consciousness, everything about your experience of supply transforms. The journey from bread consciousness to word consciousness is the most important transformation you'll ever make. Put down in the comments, "I see the difference now." Look around at the world we live in. The vast majority of people are operating entirely from bread consciousness, building their entire existence on what they can see, touch, and measure in the material realm. Their whole identity is wrapped up in their job, title, their salary, their bank balance, the house they own, the car they drive. Every decision is filtered through material considerations. Every fear is rooted in the possibility of losing something physical. They work solely for money, trust exclusively in their savings account, depend completely on visible circumstances to determine their sense of security and well-being. And this creates an incredibly fragile foundation for life. The moment that visible supply threatens to diminish, when the job is suddenly eliminated, when the business faces unexpected challenges, when the economy crashes and investments evaporate, absolute terror takes over. People spiral into panic because they have zero awareness of the invisible source that creates all material forms in the first place. They've put all their eggs in the basket of effects, never realizing there's a cause behind every effect, a source behind every material manifestation. This is the hidden danger of bread consciousness that nobody talks about. It leaves you completely vulnerable to circumstances beyond your control, tossed around by economic winds, dependent on systems and structures that can collapse at any moment. But here's where Wigglesworth's journey reveals something extraordinary. Once you truly understand that you live by the infinite flow of divine consciousness, expressing as ideas, opportunities, guidance, and creative intelligence, you've accessed the source behind all material supply. This isn't religious theory or wishful thinking. This is recognizing the fundamental operating system of reality itself. Consciousness creates. Intelligence guides. Divine ideas manifest as material forms. The bread follows automatically as effect following cause, just as fruit appears naturally on a healthy tree without forcing or struggle. Wigglesworth didn't just discover this principle and keep it to himself. He spent the next 40 years proving it works, testing it in every conceivable situation, teaching it to thousands of people across multiple continents, watching transformation after transformation as people shifted from bread consciousness to word consciousness. Business owners facing bankruptcy discovered unexpected opportunities that saved their companies. Families with no visible means of support found provision flowing from completely unanticipated directions. People who'd spent years trapped in financial struggle broke free into sustained abundance. And the consistent pattern in every single case was the same. They stopped depending on material forms as their source and started recognizing consciousness itself as the eternal wellspring of all supply. The impact of this revelation extends far beyond just financial provision. When you grasp that divine intelligence is constantly flowing through your awareness right now, generating ideas, creating opportunities, guiding decisions, you're no longer at the mercy of external circumstances. You're connected to something that transcends all material limitations. Economic recessions can't touch this source. Job markets can't diminish it. Physical circumstances can't stop its flow. The invisible creative power that sustains galaxies and orchestrates nature is the same consciousness operating within your individual awareness every single moment. This is the foundation that never fails, the source that never depletes, the supply that continues flowing regardless of what's happening in the visible world around you. What Wigglesworth proved through decades of lived experience is that this principle works with absolute consistency when you genuinely shift your dependence from bread to word, from effect to cause, from material forms to spiritual consciousness. The transformation happens not through willpower or positive thinking, but through recognition of what's already true. Leave a comment. Consciousness is my source. So how did Wigglesworth actually live this principle on a daily basis? Because understanding a concept intellectually is one thing, but integrating it into the fabric of your everyday life is something entirely different. Here's what separated him from people who just talk about spiritual principles without ever experiencing real transformation. Every single morning before even getting out of bed, he would spend 30 minutes to an hour in what he called recognition practice. And this is crucial to understand. He wasn't praying for things. He wasn't begging God to send, supply, or fix his problems. He wasn't visualizing specific outcomes or trying to manifest particular results. He was simply acknowledging the ever-present source already within him as his own consciousness, recognizing that infinite intelligence flows through his awareness right now in this moment. If this message resonated with you, if something clicked into place while watching, I'd genuinely appreciate it if you'd hit that like button. It helps this content reach others who are searching for the same truth you just discovered. Throughout each day, Wigglesworth would pause frequently during regular activities and return to the same recognition. While working, while walking, while handling business matters, he'd remind himself of the invisible source operating through his awareness. This wasn't obsessive or ritualistic. It was more like checking in with truth, realigning with reality, remembering what's actually sustaining and supplying life beneath all the visible circumstances. The impact of this consistent practice created a consciousness so stable, so rooted in the invisible source, that material fluctuations couldn't shake his inner certainty about supply. Let me share a real example that demonstrates exactly how this works in practical life. In 1952, a businesswoman named Margaret attended one of Wigglesworth's weekly teaching sessions. She was facing complete financial ruin. Her boutique, which had thrived successfully for 8 years, was suddenly failing. Creditors were threatening legal action. Suppliers had cut her off. Every logical indicator pointed to inevitable bankruptcy, and she was desperate for some kind of miraculous intervention to save her business. She came to Wigglesworth hoping he'd pray some special prayer, or give her a formula to turn things around quickly. Instead, he told her something that initially made her angry. He said directly that she was living entirely by bread, depending completely on material forms, treating her business and her customers and her sales as if they were her source of supply. She'd completely lost awareness of the invisible intelligence that creates all material success in the first place. The business had become her god, and when that god started failing, she had nothing to fall back on because she'd never recognized the true source behind the business. Wigglesworth gave her specific instructions. Stop obsessing over declining sales and mounting debts. Spend 1 hour each morning recognizing infinite intelligence flowing through your consciousness as your only source. Stop seeing your business as your source and recognize consciousness itself as the eternal wellspring. For 2 weeks, Margaret practiced this daily recognition with growing desperation because material circumstances continued worsening. Nothing changed externally. The bills kept piling up. The creditors kept calling. The situation looked hopeless from every visible angle. But then, something completely unexpected happened that she never could have orchestrated or predicted through any business strategy. A former customer from 5 years earlier called out of the blue about ordering a custom wedding dress for her daughter. This single phone call led to referrals from 5 wealthy friends who also wanted custom designs. Within 1 month, Margaret had more orders than she could physically handle and had to hire additional staff to meet demand. The transformation wasn't luck or coincidence. It was the natural result of shifting from bread consciousness to word consciousness, from depending on visible effects to recognizing the invisible cause. Write in the comments, "I'm practicing recognition daily." Margaret's story wasn't an isolated incident. Wigglesworth encountered similar transformations everywhere he traveled and taught this principle. During a teaching tour in Hawaii, he met a farmer who was weeks away from losing land that had been in his family for 3 generations. 2 consecutive crop failures from unexpected weather had devastated him financially and emotionally. The man was bitter, angry at God, convinced he was being punished for some unknown sin. Everything he'd worked for his entire life was about to disappear, and he saw absolutely no way forward. Wigglesworth asked him one direct question that cut through all the despair and victimhood. Are you living by the crops you grow, or by the intelligence that knows how to grow them? The farmer didn't understand at first. He thought Wigglesworth was mocking his desperate situation, but the question revealed the exact same pattern. This man had placed all his faith, all his security, all his trust in effects. The crops themselves had become his source. He'd completely forgotten about the invisible intelligence behind all agriculture, the divine wisdom that understands every weather pattern, every soil need, every perfect timing for planting and harvesting. He was living entirely by bread, by material results, ignoring the consciousness that creates those results. Over the next 3 months, something remarkable happened. The farmer began practicing daily recognition of infinite intelligence, guiding every decision about the land. He stopped operating purely from conventional farming wisdom and what neighbors were doing. Instead, he planted different crops based on inner guidance that came during morning meditation sessions. He changed his entire irrigation approach based on an idea that didn't make logical sense but felt right at a deeper level. His next harvest became the most profitable in 20 years. But more important than the financial success was the shift in his entire foundation. He'd learned to live by the word instead of the bread alone, to trust the invisible source instead of depending solely on visible circumstances. Then there's the story of Ruth, a widow facing eviction with 3 young children after her husband's unexpected death left them, drowning in debts with almost no insurance money. Local churches offered temporary food assistance but no lasting solution to her desperate situation. When she heard Wigglesworth explain this principle about not living by bread alone, she initially felt offended and angry. She needed bread desperately. How dare anyone suggest material supply didn't matter when her children were going hungry and homelessness loomed? But Wigglesworth clarified with genuine compassion what was being taught. Material supply is absolutely necessary and good, he told her. You need bread. Your children need food and shelter. But bread isn't your source. Consciousness is. The moment you recognize infinite intelligence as your true supply, you open yourself to receive from directions you cannot possibly imagine or predict right now. Your human mind cannot conceive the channels through which divine consciousness will provide. Ruth decided she had nothing left to lose. She stopped frantic job searching that yielded nothing and spent each morning recognizing divine ideas flowing through her awareness as her true supply. Within 5 days, unexpected opportunities appeared from multiple directions. A former neighbor offered bookkeeping work. Her landlord reduced rent. A distant relative sent financial help. These stories reveal the consistent pattern behind every transformation. The supply never comes from where logic expects. Type in the comments. I trust the invisible source. What separates people who occasionally experience breakthroughs from those who live in consistent abundance is understanding the difference between striving and resting. Wigglesworth taught a complementary practice beyond simple recognition that he called resting in the word. This involves spending time each day simply being aware of divine consciousness, without asking for anything, without trying to make anything happen, without even thinking about your needs or desires. Just pure awareness of what's already eternally true in the spiritual dimension of reality. Most people approach their entire spiritual practice like desperate begging at heaven's door. They pray frantically for this, Visualize obsessively for that. Affirm endlessly for the other thing. Always trying to get something from God as if the universe were withholding supply until they perform the right spiritual technique or say the correct words. But here's the hidden truth that changes everything. Infinite supply is already flowing right now. It's already complete. It's already fully present in consciousness. Your work isn't to create it, attract it, earn it, or manipulate it into existence. Your only task is recognizing what already exists, becoming aware of what's always been there. When you rest in quiet awareness of the infinite word proceeding from divine intelligence right now in this present moment, you naturally align with the source of all supply without effort or struggle. Ideas begin flowing effortlessly into your conscious awareness. Guidance becomes crystal clear without confusion or second-guessing. Opportunities appear in your experience because you're no longer blocking the natural flow with desperate grabbing at material effects. You've shifted from trying to get bread to simply being the word, from chasing effects to resting in cause, from anxiety about supply to peaceful recognition of consciousness itself. But Wigglesworth went even deeper with a technique that fundamentally transforms your entire identity and relationship with existence. He taught recognizing I as infinite, a practice that dissolves the illusion of separation between you and the source of all supply. When you realize with growing certainty that I am not this limited person living by bread alone, that I am infinite awareness living by every word from divine intelligence, everything changes in your experience of abundance. This recognition breaks down the false wall we've built between ourselves and our source, the imaginary separation that creates all feelings of lack and limitation. This isn't ego inflation or delusional grandiosity. It's not pretending you're God in some arrogant sense. It's recognizing the truth that mystics, saints, and spiritual teachers have pointed to for thousands of years across every tradition and culture. The awareness that's conscious in you right now, the I that knows you exist, the consciousness reading these words and understanding these concepts, that awareness is not separate from the infinite intelligence that creates galaxies, sustains universes, knows all things, and is the source of all supply throughout existence. The revelation that shifts everything is seeing that the small personal I you think you are is actually infinite consciousness expressing individually. Practice this recognition daily during quiet moments. Sit in stillness and recognize with deepening certainty, I am infinite consciousness. The awareness in me is the awareness that creates and sustains all things. I live by this infinite intelligence, not by temporary material forms. This simple practice dissolves the deep existential fear that comes from believing you're a limited, separate being trying to survive in a hostile universe. Share in the comments. I am infinite awareness. The real test of this understanding comes when material circumstances look genuinely frightening. Because it's easy to talk about living by consciousness when everything's going well, when the bank account is healthy, when business is thriving. But what happens when lack appears? When bills pile up faster than income? When the bank account dwindles toward zero and creditors start calling? These moments reveal whether you're truly living by the word or still secretly depending on bread alone. Wigglesworth taught an essential practice he called seeing through appearances that allows you to maintain consciousness of infinite supply, even when material reality looks desperate. When facing any appearance of lack, limitation, or loss, the technique is deceptively simple, but requires deliberate practice to master. You pause before reacting emotionally to the circumstance. You recognize that what you're seeing exists at the bread level of reality, the realm of effects, the material dimension where things appear and disappear. But these appearances, however real they seem to physical senses, are not the truth of consciousness. They're not the reality of the invisible source that's operating right now in the spiritual dimension. This isn't denial or pretending problems don't exist. You still pay the bills, still take responsible action, still function intelligently in practical matters. But you're no longer terrorized by appearances or paralyzed by fear because you know with certainty they're effects, not cause. You recognize the spiritual truth beneath the material appearance. Infinite intelligence is flowing right now regardless of what appears. Divine ideas are present in my consciousness this very moment, creating new forms of supply. The source of all abundance is operating as my awareness. I live by the word of God, not by temporary appearances of bread alone. The impact of consistently practicing this perspective creates a profound shift over time. Effects must eventually align with the reality of infinite supply that exists in consciousness first, then manifests in material form as demonstration. You're no longer at the mercy of circumstances because you've anchored yourself in the invisible cause that creates all visible effects. This is the journey from fear-based living to consciousness-based living, from reactive panic to proactive peace. After sustained practice of recognizing infinite consciousness as your only source, something transformative happens that goes beyond occasional breakthroughs or temporary relief. Your entire relationship with material reality fundamentally changes at the deepest level. Fear of lack dissolves completely. And here's what's crucial to understand. This dissolution doesn't happen because you suddenly have more material wealth or because all your problems disappear. It happens because you've developed unshakable certainty about the inexhaustible nature of the source you're living by. You know beyond any doubt that consciousness never depletes, never fails, never runs out regardless of outer circumstances. Wigglesworth lived this completely transformed life for the final decades of his teaching career. Students and colleagues noted his unusual peace about material concerns that seemed almost superhuman. He trusted the invisible source absolutely because he'd proven it utterly reliable through thousands of demonstrations over years of practice. He demonstrated daily that this principle isn't abstract spiritual theory, divorced from real life, but practical, livable reality, accessible to anyone willing to make the shift from bread consciousness to word consciousness. Leave a comment. I choose consciousness over fear. So here's what I want you to take away from everything we've explored together today. The principle Wigglesworth discovered isn't reserved for spiritual masters or people with extraordinary faith. It's accessible to you right now in this moment, regardless of where you're starting from financially or spiritually. The shift from living by bread alone to living by the infinite word flowing through consciousness is available the instant you begin recognizing the invisible source within your own awareness. If this message resonated with you, if something clicked into place while watching, I'd genuinely appreciate it if you'd hit that like button. It helps this content reach others who are searching for the same truth you just discovered. And if you haven't already joined our community here, go ahead and subscribe, because we dive deep into these transformative spiritual principles regularly. This isn't surface level content. We're exploring the hidden truths that actually change lives, the teachings that shift consciousness from fear to faith, from lack to abundance, from striving to resting in divine supply. Leave a comment right now saying, "This message was meant for me," if you made it all the way to the end. I read every single comment, and I love seeing who's on this journey with us, recognizing consciousness as the true source of all supply. There's a video right here that takes this understanding even deeper into practical application. Click and continue with me over there, because what you're about to discover will give you specific tools to integrate this principle into your daily life starting tomorrow morning. I'll see you in the next one.